I'm Chelsea of Friday Pattern Company, and this week we are doing the square neck top sew along. This is a fun, easy to sew pattern that comes with a lot of options. So the pattern itself comes with pattern pieces to make it from a knit or a woven, and then you also get 2 cup sizes. The pattern goes from extra small to 7X, and yeah, it's really fun. You can make it out of a lot of things, different types of fabric, and it's a pullover top, so I always like that for just, you know, wearing in the hotter months. You don't want to be dealing with like buttons and zippers and stuff, so it's fun, it's easy, it's simple. The fabric I'm using for this sew along is a cotton linen jacquard that I picked up from Blackbird Fabrics. I'll link it down below. It's so beautiful, and it is a woven fabric, so the instructions are slightly different if you were making it from a knit, but it's all included in the pattern. So we're gonna go over sewing it in a woven fabric for this video. Anyway, that's about it. Let's get started. Before we get started with sewing, we're gonna mark our dart placement on our front pieces. So I take my pattern piece and I cut down 1 dart leg, and then I can fold that up along the other dart leg, and that gives me a little triangle that'll make it easier for me to line this up on the fabric and mark it. Now that I have that cut, I can lay my front piece A out with the wrong side facing up. It's kind of hard to tell on this fabric, and place the pattern piece over it, and then use a marking tool. I'm using a Choco liner. It just is this little chalk roller, and just mark out the legs of the dart that I'll use as a stitching guide when I go to sew them. And then after you've done the one side, you can flip your pattern piece and mark it on the other side. Next up, we are going to fuse interfacing onto the wrong side of our front neckline facing and our back neckline facing. So I'm laying that out wrong side facing up, and then I'm sticking my fusible interfacing glue side down onto the fabric, and then we'll cover it with a little cloth so that we're not touching our iron onto the interfacing. And then we will use a hot, steamy iron to press the interfacing onto the facing pieces. You're going to repeat this with your front and back neckline facings. Now it's time to stay stitch our necklines. So we do stay stitch on the front and back necklines so that while we're sewing, our necklines don't get stretched out or warped, because we really want them to keep their shape. So you're just going to use a straight stitch and sew a 1/2 inch from the edge around the front neckline and the back neckline. Now it's time to sew up our darts. So what you're going to do is lay out your front piece wrong side facing up so that you can see where you marked your darts, and you're just going to match them up with a couple pins. Then we'll take it over to the sewing machine and you just sew down the leg of the dart. Now we're at our sewing machine and we're just going to follow the line down our dart. So you just sew down the length of your dart. And there's a lot of different ways to finish a dart. So a lot of people will leave some extra thread at the end and tie it off. And I'm going to tell you my tried and true method that has never failed me but does not seem super secure, but I swear it is. It's that you get close at the end and you take your last few stitches just catching the tiniest bit of fabric, and then you sew off the end, and you sew, just let your machine sew a few stitches, and then it twists it, and I swear it doesn't come undone, but you can leave thread and tie it off if you want. Now that you've got both your darts sewn, we are going to sew the front to back at shoulder seams. So right sides together, lay your fabric pieces out and match up the shoulder seams. We're going to pin these in place, and then we're going to take them to the sewing machine and we'll sew using our 5/8 inch seam allowance. And you're going to repeat on both shoulders. After you finish sewing your front to back at shoulder seams, we are going to press those seams open, and then we will finish the raw edges. The seam finish I'm using for this project is just zigzagging over the edge, and we have a whole video on seam finishes that you can reference so that you can find the perfect finish for you. But for this project, I'm just using a zigzag stitch, and I'm just letting 1 stitch fall over the raw edge, and it just encases the edge, and it gives it kind of like, you can't really see this finish very well, but I like it for just simple being able to stay at one machine, not having to switch back and forth with my serger. Right sides together, pin your front neckline facing to your back neckline facing at the shoulder seam, and then use your 5/8 inch seam allowance to sew them together on both sides. After that, you're just going to press those seams open. Now we're going to sew a stitch around the outer edge of our neckline facing. We're going to do this 1/4 of an inch all the way around. This stitch is going to be a guide for pressing our neckline facing in the next step. Now back at your iron, press the outer edge of your facing under 1/4 inch all the way around, and you're using that stitch that you made in the last step as a handy guide. It's time to make this top a square neck top, which means we're joining the facing to the main fabric to form the cool square neckline. So right sides together, pin your neckline facing to your top, and you're gonna match shoulder seams and notches and the square corners of your neckline. Once you have it all pinned into place, we'll take it over to the sewing machine and use the 5/8 inch seam allowance to sew all the way around your neckline. Now that we have that sewn, we'll do some clipping and trimming. You're gonna clip your back neckline so that it can lay really nice and flat. You'll do this by trimming into the seam allowance just up to the seam line without clipping through it. And you'll do this about every inch or so along the back neckline. Then you'll move over to the front neckline, and just in these corners of the square, you want to clip all the way into the seam allowance to that corner stitch without clipping through it. And you want to get close here, and this will help give you a really square neckline. Now we're going to understitch the seam allowance to the neckline facing. So that means we push the facing away from the body of the top, and we sew 1/8 of an inch from where the facing and the top are joined, where we're sewing through the facing and the seam allowance. And we don't sew all the way around the corners. We just get as close to the corners as we can, and then you start a new stitch, because you can't, if you go right into the corners, it'll cause it to warp. So you'll just work your way around the neckline, understitching the front and the back. We'll head back to our iron, and we're gonna press the facing to the wrong side of the top. We'll give it a good press, and then we'll add a bunch of pins to hold it perfectly in place so that we can bring it over to the sewing machine and edge stitch it in place. You want to make sure that that edge that you pressed in a couple steps ago is still pressed under, and that everything is neatly in place, because when we sew this seam will show on the face of our garment, and it's going to look good, but you want it to be neat. So using a lot of pins here kind of sets you up for success. Back over at the old sewing machine, we are going to edge stitch our facing in place. So we've got our project wrong side facing up, and we're just sewing 1/8 of an inch from the folded edge of our neckline facing and working our way carefully around the neckline. Take a brief moment to admire your beautiful square neckline, give it a good press, and then flip your top right sides together, and we're going to match up the side seams. We'll pin those in place and then just sew down the side seams using our 5/8 inch seam allowance. After you've done that, you will press it open and finish the edges, and you're going to repeat that on both sides. Now that that's done, all we have to do is do the sleeve hems and the hem of the top. This top comes together so quickly, like the neckline takes a while, but once that's done, it's like, oh, oops, top's done. Anyway, so what you'll do is you'll press the hem edge of your sleeve under 3/8 of an inch, and then press it under another 3/8 of an inch, and then you will edge stitch around that. You'll repeat that on both sleeves and then also on the hem of your top. And here we are at the machine ready to do our edge stitching. So you'll just use that folded edge as a guide and just edge stitch around the hem opening. Here is the finished top. I love how it's just kind of a simple style, but the square neckline really gives it something special so that it's not just, you know, a boxy woven top. It has some visual interest, but it's a really simple design that you can wear tucked in or untucked. And I have it here with a pair of free range slacks by Sew House 7. Those are really great pants, but that's a whole different story. Anyway, that is it. I hope that this sew along was helpful for you, and I hope that you make a million square neck tops and you love them and feel comfortable and fashionable all summer.